paper, I actually wanted to pull out a couple things before we open up the conversation. And first is, I wonder if you can concretize some of the mapping of your project, because you have, on the one hand, spaces where art is happening, right? Like the Lenin statue, spaces in the city. And then you have institutions, like the Visual Culture Research Center, right? That are institutions, but that also have spaces. And then you have particular people who are both of Ukraine and not of Ukraine. So I'm wondering if you can sort of map this project a little bit, and also talk about how Kiev relates to other cities in Ukraine, right? Izolatia comes from Donbass, but is now in Kiev. Is there a way that this is sort of a story of art happening in Kiev, or is this a larger Ukrainian story that you're telling here?
Excellent questions, thank you. I would say it is largely about Kiev, yeah.
Yeah.
And certainly the spaces could be mapped through their happening, but I think there is also something that is important, which I talk a little bit about in the paper, is that during their initial years, the Visual Culture Research Center was expelled from Kiev Mohyla for putting on display images of same-sex desire and nudity. And then they went to a new location, the Kino Zhotin, October Cinema, ended up having to leave there. So they've been largely a movable feast.
A movable institution, kind of, yeah.
Yeah, so by necessity, they've had to even make that a part of their work. But there's also some interesting documentation that I would highly recommend anybody who's interested in the work that's coming out of contemporary collectives in Kiev to look at. And that would be some specific exhibits. Disputed Territory is one that happened in 2014, in which the actual use of maps becomes a material for making art. So there's an artist, Yuri Solomko, who uses maps of Ukraine and superimposes images of maybe Berehinia or defenders from the, like soldiers, army soldiers. So there's certainly a lot of layers to this question, and I'm still working through all of them, but
absolutely.
Yes.
And what about the artists involved? I mean, I was very struck, particularly in your paper, how the one project has 2 Austrian curators, right? And then you talk about Cynthia Gutierrez, who's not from Ukraine. So what is the sort of the international dimension here? Mm-hmm. And what, this might sound like sort of an odd question, but what makes it Ukrainian art?
Mm-hmm. Good question, good question. So the history of the avant-garde has always tried to make itself very international, whether accomplishing that in real terms or sort of affecting an internationalization of ideas. And I think that is exactly what's happening here, that these artists are very much avant-garde by the fact that they are 20, 30 years old, 35, and just, on the cusp of using like social media and these new forms.
Yeah.
And you have participants largely coming from Europe. The audience and the sponsors for this art are mostly EU.
Right.
So that's also
not
Ukrainian.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the reason cited for that with regard to the Biennale that happened in 2015, which was such a landmark event for contemporary artists in Kiev, was that state funding was pulled for the arts and put into the budget for the war.
Right.
And there was just like a scrambling to get volunteers to pick up that slack and raise money at the last minute. And a lot of that funding has come from Germany, actually.
Right.
So that's, and Austria.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so another sort of theme I wanted to pull out was this theme of the Soviet legacy and the Soviet context. And I was so struck in the paper by your discussion of the role of the artist and how these artists are very concerned with the role of the artist. You write, art is the practice of displaying and interpreting information It leverages self, audience, and public in critique. Thus, art always contains an element of social controversy. And so it seems to me very much engagé artists, right? Artists who are really kind of walking that line between art and activism. And I'm wondering, I mean, there's a way that that's oddly Soviet, and maybe it's just because I work on artists in the 1920s, but they were very socially engaged as well, right? And very much interested in kind of art changing the world and actually, so doing something. And so I'm interested in the way that these artists are both de-Sovietizing, right? I mean, trying to move beyond a Soviet legacy, and yet at the same time kind of recuperating that sense of art as activism.
Definitely, yeah. It is kind of this dialectic, for lack of a better term,
To be
as
totally
Marx
socialist,
would
yeah.
say.
Yeah.
It's certainly, and I think what's interesting too is the role of Poland in this art.
Interesting, how so?
More than many other countries, the, I guess, ideological nuances are coming out of this journal, Krytyka Polityczna, that started in Warsaw maybe 2006 or so, and really gained momentum around 2010 in Ukraine when they opened a branch there.
Right.
And lots of younger people have edited with that journal and had opportunities to have conversations about a left,
Yeah.
how to create a left or nourish a left in countries where there were mass atrocities committed.
Right, where the left has a bad reputation in a sense, right?
Definitely.
Right.
Yeah.
But it does seem like these are young artists who are leftist young artists, right, trying to engage in art as activism, and that to me has such as a historian, that has such a resonance.
Yeah, definitely. And has a resonance in Poland with one of the only places in the world where you've really seen in the 20th century collisions between the working class and intellectuals through the
Right.
Solidarity movement.
Right.
And perhaps, this legacy is also at play somewhat, like how to create space and dialogue in Kiev, where these artists are largely basing their work in a way that doesn't alienate. That is a question that I'm still asking in my work, is like how open can the avant-garde really be as activists, like how socially appealing can it be to a wider mass audience?
Yeah, so that's actually my final question, and then we'll open this up. But this, what is their audience, right? I mean, it seems to be, there's a way that you have a very engaged, intellectual, educated, well-traveled, young urban artists. So do non-intellectual, average, everyday people from the Kiev suburbs come to see this art?
Well, there have been a lot of clashes. So this, I guess, can also refer back to your prior question about activism.
Yeah.
Art, I try not to place art too much on a spectrum between left and right in my readings of art, because I think it sometimes can do a disservice to the nuances of that art. However, when you take a painting or a photograph and you put it into a museum, and then you have people come and attack you, or the people in the photo are attacked and they have to leave their country and emigrate, then it becomes political and maybe can be put on a left-right spectrum when those doing the attacking put themselves on the right. So in terms of spaces, I think that these projects are largely about safe spaces, or creating a litmus that makes it safer for others who maybe don't relate immediately to a photograph of two lesbian women raising a child at home together, but the very fact that that photograph was in that space and created some kind of controversy maybe makes it okay for others in the future to have that freedom.
Okay.
So that would be my answer.
Great. I mean, I think we could talk about this for a much longer time, but I'd love to hear other comments and questions. Yes, Anna.
Thank you. Anna Colin Lebedev, Paris, France. Thank you so much for this presentation that gives us really a sense of what's going on in the in post-Maidan artistic production. Even if your scope is mostly on Kiev, I would like to ask you maybe a little more general question on the regional dimension of this art and activism. I know that in literature and poetry, it seems very relevant, the linguistic dimension and also the region from where the people come from. Is there a regional dimension in the groups, topics, artistic way of expressing things?
Yes, so I just want to clarify your question, an original dimension?
Regional.
Okay, yes, pardon me. Regional dimension. Yes, some of the images I was not able to show today, part of a new project called Shifting Landscapes, Ukrainian artists negotiating war. Many of those images, contemporary pieces being created by artists from Kiev and also from East Ukraine. Actually, Vlada Ralko and others, I believe, they are from occupied territories. They're making art about the war now, which I think, in terms of having regional dimension, is a way of maybe, I guess, reclaiming the space for an artist as well to make art during a time of war. Because a question I often receive is, why do you work on this when Ukraine is at war? Art is like tertiary concern. We should be taking care of other priorities first, and this is reflected often in state budgets too. So for the regional dimension, I think it's very critical that these artists from Kiev are reaching out and talking about other regions. And not attempting to speak on behalf of those regions necessarily, or expand and say Kiev can stand in place for all of Ukraine, because there are unique stories in every location. And for that reason too, I think I'm very hopeful, because this idea of local value, having a local legacy, whether it is Kiev or Crimea or anywhere, this is something that artists around the world are struggling for now with globalization and the erasure of local dimension through corporatization of art and things like this.
Other questions? Yeah, Victoria.
Victoria Sereda. I would like to bring one more dimension. If we are talking about Kiev, in Kiev recently, post-Maidan time, we have numbers and numbers of murals appearing on walls, and actually we also have international artistic community involved in production of those murals. Maybe you can comment a little bit on it. And the second question also about the involvement of international local artistic community to discussions about erection of new Heavenly 100 monument, how it relates to your topic.
Great, thank you. I am less familiar with the murals because they are so recent. However, in some of my consultation with artists and activists in Kiev, there's quite a bit of controversy surrounding them because they appeared so quickly and perhaps could have involved more public discussion or a kind of maybe system of voting and using local talent. So that would be something that I would research more. But I don't include it in my project because it's a very different kind of work, kind of art, aesthetically, and also in the way that it's produced. It's produced by more established, older artists coming from many different countries. I'm looking really specifically at a generation in Kiev trying to depict or trace their evolution in time. I would also say, that being said, I guess, the Heavenly 100 Memorial and also the Maidan Museum, which is underway right now, that those in particular are involving public discussion and are perhaps good templates for the kinds of spaces that can appeal to a mass audience. And I think that this is something, it's a very different kind of art than what I'm looking at, but I think it will be it will involve a wider audience, certainly. Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah, very interesting. I was wondering.
Yeah,
Oh, I'm sorry.
and just introduce yourself.
Anthony Butts, director of DIY Country. My question is, you've been looking at the work of mostly liberal, pro-Ukrainian artists, and I was interested in the reaction that's coming from the other side, because for every time, some same-sex activist art comes out, there's a corresponding reaction on the other side. And when I was in Donetsk and Lugansk, I saw, speaking with some artists who were now propagandists and who were making art to counter that, and subverting various Western film tropes, for instance, the Hunger Games or Star Wars or something like that. And it struck me as rather interesting art wars,
Yeah, yeah.
What one is coming at it from a super liberal view, and the other is more like a Donald Trump supporter art. So I was just interested if there's been any work done on that interplay and the art from the other side. Thank you.
Great question. Yes, aesthetics sometimes can be a great, way of trying to see where the sides are, and because the definition, of propaganda is up for debate. And I think, as I was saying before, as soon as you have individuals being attacked or you have identities being censored or erased, then you can place art production into more of the concrete left versus right or sides, because aesthetics travel in very polyvalent ways, especially if you're working with visual culture. One aesthetic can be used on both sides, and the circulation or reception of that work then changes its meaning each time it may be appropriated or consumed or sold for profit that is then invested in various projects. So I think the specificity of the works that I'm looking at, if we were to put them into an intellectual trajectory, are coming on the heels of Hal Foster's writing about the valences of art having some kind of critical value to the public sphere. So Frankfurt School and post-Frankfurt School thinkers and a lot of amazing scholars like Nancy Fraser writing about gender and identity, which I talk about in my paper a little more, are also very focused on the body. And these works, what I like about them and what I like about this generation is within spaces, we all experience spaces through our bodies. We move through them. And sometimes we cannot move through them because somebody is opposing us from expressing ourselves in a space as an artist, a scholar, an individual. So that's really where the politics break down. And that's what I'm really looking at in my study. I'm narrowly looking at bodies and gender. Yeah.
Tamara.
Yeah, Tamara Marcinyuk, Ukraine Kiev Mohila Academy. Thanks a lot. And I just wonder, because in your paper, in introduction, you wrote that your activists or respondents, they are major working with feminist and LGBT issues. So why did you choose these particular topics? Are those topics major agenda, or because I think there are actually wider scope of problems like class issues, maybe racism. So why those topics?
Thank you. Excellent. Yes, there's a intersection of class, race, and gender in all of these works. And I'm most interested in gender and women's studies because I am a woman, but also because I had the good fortune of meeting so many wonderful feminist activists in Ukraine over the past 10 years, and just really liked what they had to say and was interested in creating a transnational dialogue, because there is very wonderful and often suppressed history of women in the West and women in Ukraine speaking to each other about critical issues. Martha Bohachevsky-Homiak's book is really an authoritative source on this for the 1920s and 1930s. Thanks.
Yes.
Ina Malinkovska, Davis Center, Harvard University. You provided one kind of narrative of past and modern history that is created and provided by the street artists. This narrative certainly challenged or is an alternative to the narrative provided by state institutions and perhaps also by business elites who are doing something in philanthropy activities. So what is the relationships between those, say, three narratives? You mentioned some examples of cooperation, why this cooperation happened, and where do we have conflict, why we have that conflict, and how this triangle of cooperation and relations look like in Ukraine. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yes. I would love to do a separate study simply on art and finance in Kiev, because you have independent financiers like Pinchuk, the Pinchuk Center, and you also have really amazing large museums that have sprung up in the last 10 years, like Arsenal, who's, I know the director of Arsenal was a very controversial figure in recent years and has provoked some, protests about creating a public system for nominating directors. She was appointed, I believe, under Yanukovych and continued to occupy her post well after the Maidan. I know that artists in these groups, although they do maintain some autonomy from independent investors in the state, they also benefit from Pinchuk Center. There's an annual contest that happens there, and some of them have won this contest. So it's a very complex network of funding and also elites that are able to support the arts, or patrons. So I could really spend a year just studying this, and I think it would be a worthwhile study if anybody wants to take that up.
Please.
Danyliw, I'm a retired public servant. I'm interested in public policy issues, and you talked about the controversies going on, especially on the LGBT front. I was curious about the relationship between the artistic community and I suppose because it's the capital, the Ministry of Culture and the city authorities, and the kind of creative tensions that exist between institutions which are conservative by nature and certainly Soviet legacies, and also the obvious discomfort in the eastern part of Europe with the LGBT issues. I wonder if you could just talk about that and how, and I mean, also that you point out there are patrons involved as well with moneyed interests. So I wonder if you could talk about that dynamic and are there any potential issues that they're facing?
Yes. So just as an overview, there are a couple very key moments that happened with regard to the outcome of the Maidan that were gains for the LGBT community. One was the overturning of the censorship laws that were largely aimed at criminalizing homosexuality, which has an antecedent in Russian policy as well. Ukraine was the first to decriminalize homosexuality in 1991, and I believe that in this moment and climate also of the decommunization laws, that has served the LGBT rights community very well, that fact of decriminalization. I know also one of the first marches, Pride marches, was held in Kiev in the last 3 years. Just this year, there was another one. The police have provided a shield for those marches to allow them to happen. So there have been, some very critical gains just in the last 2 years that I think are really hopeful.
Great. So we have 5 more minutes and 2 last questions. So I'm going to ask you guys to ask your questions together, and then we'll leave it to Jessica to wrap up. So Jesse, and then Regis.
So Jesse Driscoll, University of California. This is really fascinating. I'm really interested in memory. I'm really interested in how it's institutionalized in museums and monuments. And this is really a yes/no question.
Sure.
From your presentation, it sounded like there has been a gutting of the parts of the Ukraine state budget that would subsidize art, but that gap has been filled by Western donors. And if the answer to that is that basically yes, with some nuances, how much money are we talking about?
You can answer that quickly, yes.
Yes. Quite a lot. And not only Western independent donors or cultural institutions like the Goethe Foundation, but also the Finnish Ministry of Culture, Swedish Ministry of Culture, they've given money. So I would say well into the millions at least, but I can't quote exact numbers. I would need to do that. Cultural studies people are not good with numbers. No, I'm just kidding. But it's quite a lot, yeah.
Good morning. Régis Janté, I'm a journalist, French, based in Tbilisi. If I compare with the Georgian Revolution, the 10 years of Saakashvili's power, there were no cultural revolution. And as Saakashvili told me once, because it was coming from the top, and so we didn't see this kind of things. And so when the power has to deal with the past, I want to speak about the Soviet legacy, they were just erasing statue of Stalin, erasing the years of Andropov, it was a building in Tbilisi. I see that in Ukraine it's somehow different. So is there a clear divide between, let's say, the political side with the law on decommunization and the artistic scene, which is very different, because I see that they are dealing with the past, they are representing it and so on. And my second question on the other side of the question is how they are dealing with this past. Are they've got some distance with the past? Are they doing some humor? Or is there also a temptation to erase?
Mm-hmm. Interesting, yeah. It's complex. And yeah. It reminds me, your question also shares some basis with what Meha was asking earlier, in which, the past can become a weapon of the present and the future, and it is about recreating the state as well as much as it is about embodying everyday life, which was a common theme among avant-garde artists in the 1920s and 30s, thinking about everyday life as a site for politics. And I would say that also institutionally, there's a lot of interest in museums, and part of this too comes from the history of museums after the Bolshevik Revolution as well as after Maidan. So after the Bolshevik Revolution, all property for the countryside largely was seized and put into museums. So the spectacle of value became a form of art, or even justification for the new state, which is fascinating if we take into consideration what happened with Yanukovych's estate after the events on Maidan. The property that he had stolen from the public was put into the museum. And this was a reenactment, but also a change from that earlier moment where property was used to justify state power. Suddenly it was used to show corruption. So where that's going in the future is still an open experiment, and I think we'll see a lot of involvement, a lot of debate. I think that this interest will only grow.
Great. Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for kicking off the Danyliw seminar in great style. So let's have a round of applause for Jessica Zychowicz.